Pakistan. We've got folks from England and Texas, two of my favorite countries. And my dad was a pastor in both places. And Pakistan, too. People all over.
We met with a delegation from England yesterday about terrorism and homelessness out here in Portland. So, wow, that's neat to see that.
My father was a pastor in Buckinghamshire.
So we are now recording. So let me begin our official welcome my name is Sarah Saltee. I'm the Director of Leadership and Learning Programs at the Center for Partnership Studies. And on the behalf of the Center for Partnership Studies, I want to welcome all of you to this important conversation, uncovering the roots of violence, new perspectives on domestic violence, social justice, and faith, with Riane Eisler, Julie Owens, Ron Clark, and joining us very soon, we trust, our moderator, Renita Robinson. Those of you who are joining us live today, we're delighted that you're here. And to those of you listening on the replay, we welcome you as well and hope all listeners hear something today that shifts your own thinking about the interconnections between violence, social justice, and faith. Before we go any further, I want to thank our wonderful co-sponsoring organizations who worked with us to help get the word out about this event, including Pathways to Safety International, Safe Alliance, Agape Church of Christ, Battering Intervention Services Coalition of Michigan, Faith Trust Institute, North Carolina Council of Churches, and the Pixel Project. We will be providing links to each of these organizations in our follow-up materials, so if you're not familiar with their fine work, you can learn more about each of them then. We want to especially welcome our participants today, attendees today, who are joining us from those organizations. We're really delighted to have you with us. I also want to take just a moment and thank Ann Amberg, who you are seeing in the chat box today, where she's helping to tend the conversation there. She is also our marketing communications coordinator, who did just a tremendous job to make all of these partnerships possible. So thank you, Ann. Let me just quickly check our chat, and I think what we will do is, I was going to introduce you now to Renita Robinson, and I think I will go ahead and do that now. If she's not able to join us until just a bit later, you will know who she is. So Renita is currently the CEO of the Green Bay, Wisconsin YWCA. Prior to that role, she has been an advocate, educator, and supporter for victims of sexual and domestic violence across the life, gender, and race spans. She has served as the executive director of the Committee Against Domestic Violence, the Committee Against Domestic Abuse Incorporated, which is the largest provider of domestic and sexual violence services in southern Minnesota. Renita has also been the director of the Duluth Family Visitation Center, a program of the world-renowned Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs, DAIP, which many of you are familiar with. She's also served as adjunct instructor at 3 Midwestern universities, where she's taught a range of courses to undergraduate and graduate students in education and sociology. Renita designed and directed the Mirror Project in Nebraska, which was a non-medical recovery program within a 400-bed homeless shelter in the People's City Mission of Lincoln, Nebraska. The emphasis there was on female domestic violence survivors with life-controlling addictions. Renita was also a trainer with DAIP on post-separation violence, bringing to light how institutions designed to help victims often collude with abusers because they fail to recognize their insidious tactics. Her favorite accomplishment, she says, is raising 2 compassionate sons. And we will embrace Renita with open arms as soon as she's able to be with us. I know that our wonderful Anne is working behind the scenes to see if we can't facilitate that in happening. I think what I will do, and I apologize, I don't have my formal introductory materials for our panelists today, so I'm going to invite each of you to introduce yourself as you begin. Renita has those materials with her, and hopefully as she rolls in, we'll be able to hear more about each of you in a more formal way. But I think what we'll do, if that sounds good to you all, is to begin with Julie. And Julie, if you would introduce yourself.
Okay, that's fine.
I asked you to do that. And then let me know as you would like to see the slides advancing for your introductory remarks.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really an honor to be here with Dr. Eisler, someone I've admired for many years. And great to be here with Ron too, and Renita when we get her. Thank you, Sarah. I am a survivor of domestic violence. I'm going to tell you a bit about my story, and I've been working in the field now for almost 30 years. And I grew up in a pastor's home. And that's why the issue of faith, of course, is very important to me, because it was a big part of my upbringing and has been a big part of my entire life. I've worked with domestic violence victims for many, many years in many different capacities. And now I'm doing training and technical assistance, consultation, expert witness work, that type of thing. So a bit about me, my background. I grew up in the South. It was a pretty conservative background. Fortunately, I grew up in a family that was really loving and wonderful, and my parents are still to this day, after 65 years of marriage, amazing role models for partnership and equality. And so that really set me on a path to knowing what I wanted in a relationship and what I expected. And in spite of growing up in an environment where I think in rural Kentucky, I don't think there was a lot of empowerment going on of women at the time, back in the 50s. But as I said, my family was very much supportive of me thinking for myself and making my own decisions. But the era in which I grew up was very in the church in the South, I think, was very different than it is to some extent today. And there was some backlash that started to develop in the 60s, after the women's movement began. And so a couple of the leading figures in the evangelical Christian church in which I was growing up had some things to say that were influential and disturbing, I would say, to me now. I wanted to just share a little bit of that so you get a sense of kind of what I was growing up with. One leader said, I listen to feminists and all the radical gals. Most of them are failures. They've blown it. Some of them have been married, but they married some Casper milquetoast who asked permission to go to the bathroom. These women just need a man in the house. That's all they need. Most of the feminists need a man to tell them what time of day it is and to lead them home. And they blew it, and they're mad at men. And feminists hate men. They're sexist. They hate men. That's their problem. And that's from late Reverend Jerry Falwell. And then another pastor who was very influential when I was growing up because of his television ministry was Pat Robertson. And he said, the feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It's about a socialist, anti-family political that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. So suffice it to say, I had my work cut out for me, talking about violence against women and gender equality in the conservative Southern church. Fortunately, we've come a long way, and obviously no one has to be anti-man to be pro-woman or pro-partnership, which is what we're talking about today. domination of no one by anyone, but partnership in all its wonderfulness. So what happened, and if we could see the first slide, this was kind of my growing up, the teachings in the church about the family. So we were taught that God, in the person of Christ, was the covering for all Christians. And in the family, the model was that Christ would be the head, and then the husband, and then the wife, and then the children. And as you can see, and this was taught and still continues to be taught quite a bit in the evangelical church. And so the natural order of the family was taught. And so women who were being abused would be taught things like pray, stay, and obey. I got married when I was 32. I certainly didn't expect to be abused. He was very kind before we married, but then he became very psychologically abusive right away. And when I asked him why was he doing this to me and why didn't he do it before we got married, he just said, "You never would have married me." So I wasn't quite sure exactly how to proceed. So I did talk to pastors. I talked to the pastor who married us. I talked to counselors, including Christian counselors. And I was really encouraged to work on the relationship. No one identified what was going on as abuse because I wasn't being hit. And I kind of believed the same myths that everybody else did, I guess, about domestic violence. You know, I thought victims were people that were getting beat up all the time. That wasn't my experience, although eventually there were a lot of threats. But my religion was a part of my understanding. I think that male privilege that is part of the way I was raised and taught, I hadn't really thought a whole lot about it. When I left my husband, I filed for divorce because the abuse got so extreme, the psychological abuse and the threats. He came back and broke in the house and waited for me and my father to kill us. And he assaulted us. It was very brutal. And we survived it. And in doing so, we got a big lesson about domestic violence that we never wanted. And so we started talking to the church about it and getting educated ourselves. Reverend Marie Fortune's at Faith Trust Institute, one of our sponsors, was very influential in my life. And she made a documentary called Broken Vows that tells the story of different women of faith who have been abused. And her book, Keeping the Faith, was very influential for me. Going to a domestic violence support group was a powerful thing for me as well. And that's where I learned about Reverend Marie Fortune. And so we started a shelter, transitional shelter at our church, and an interfaith coalition. And that kind of got my work underway. I left special ed. I went back to college. And that's where I was introduced to Riane's book, The Chalice and the Blade. And that really opened up my mind on a whole other level to understand the history of women and the oppression of women and the intersection of that with other oppressions, and particularly violence in all of its forms. And being informed in that way really changed me. That it changed how I saw the world. It changed how I saw religion. And I understood that we had an awful lot of work to do. It was just not a matter of just trying to hold accountable individual men who abuse women, but really changing society. And that's what Riane Eisler is talking about in her book, Chalice and the Blade. Most of you have read it, I presume, and the partnership model. So if we can look at the next slide, I will just share with you that this is a graphic we use, developed in Duluth, Minnesota. It's called the Power and Control Wheel, and this is how we teach domestic violence. And when this was introduced to me in my support group for the first time, I remember saying, "Oh my gosh, were we all married to the same man?" Because all the women around the table were telling the same stories. And so the different forms of abuse that women experience in their intimate partnerships are here, and the physical abuse and sexual abuse are on the outside of that wheel. Then they are also possible and very powerful when they're happening. As I moved on and learned more from Dr. Eisler's work and others, I began to learn how domestic violence and other forms of violence against women are influenced by our culture in large ways. So if you can show us the next slide, the cultural influences around power and control and domestic violence, coercive control, intimate partner abuse. There are so many institutions that you can see here, traditions and values that keep power and control and intimate relationships in the hands of males. And learning this even further informed me about what systems were going to need to change and how a paradigm shift would have to underpin all of this. Moving from partnership to domination, in order to address sexism and racism, inequality, all of the oppressions are connected because someone's always on top and someone's on the bottom. And we don't want people divided into groups, and we're going to have to work together. So I met Dr. Catherine Clark Krager, who was one of the founders of Christians for Biblical Equality, and she was someone who taught me so much. She was a biblical scholar who read her Bible from the original Greek and Hebrew, and she taught me a lot about things that the Bible said and didn't say, some which I had been taught, mistaught, and learning that changed me further. And I think the next slide is it? I think it might be the list. So these are some of the things that I learned I had misunderstood because of the way I'd been taught about the creation of man and women, that women and men weren't created equal in the eyes of God. I didn't know that wasn't true. That husbands are to be the heads of their wives. And that there's a hierarchy in Christian marriage. Also something that is a result of mistranslation, that wives must submit to their husbands, but nothing about husbands submitting to their wives. And we know the true translation is around mutual submission. And I should just note that the true translation of head, in the context that it has been misinterpreted from, means source, like head of a river. Teachings around divorce, the inability to divorce, the prohibition against divorce, and the theology of suffering, that it's my cross to bear. I just have to live with this. And forgiveness, a misunderstanding around just needing to always forgive, even when someone hadn't repented. So these are things that in my 30 years of working with women in the church, I've found these to be, as Dr. Marie Fortune says, either roadblocks or resources. And I've worked hard now to educate pastors and faith leaders around these things, because so often, like everything else, these are traditions and beliefs that are passed down. And most people don't read the scriptures in the original Greek and Hebrew. I know I don't, but I am educated by some who have done so, thankfully. The next slide I want to just share with you is really important, because this is the equality wheel, also developed at the Duluth Domestic Abuse Intervention Project. This is a picture of a healthy relationship. And what's important about it is that it's all about mutuality, partnership, trust, respect, shared responsibility, shared parenting, honesty and accountability. So if you look at the power and control wheel and then you look at the equality wheel, you'll see that they're pretty much mirror opposites. But still, in the church and in religion, we know that it isn't always taught, is it? So there are several camps in the evangelical church today, complementarianism and egalitarianism, which believe different things about how men and women were created and whether or not they're equal. And there's one more slide I just wanted to point out to you, and this is another version of the equality wheel. Do we have that, Sarah? Oh, it didn't. Okay. Well, I just wanted to mention that I did find one. I thought I'd put it on a slide. Maybe I didn't. But this week came across one where equality had been removed from the middle. And I realized that there's a reason for that, because there are a lot of people in religion and church who don't want to see women getting beaten, but they also don't believe that they are equal to men. And to me, that's the linchpin. That's the bottom line when we're teaching about violence against women and their oppression in religion. I think that's something that we need to continue to talk about and to address and to challenge.
Thank you so much, Julie. I appreciate your opening remarks so much, and and thank you for introducing yourself.
No problem.
Really, really pleased that we now are joined by Renita, who Renita, I don't know if you were hearing when I introduced you.
I could hear everything. I heard you guys from the very, very beginning. So,
Good.
Have arrived. So thank you all.
So, Renita, I know that you, if you'd like to kind of take us back a half step and offer your opening remarks, that would be wonderful. If you'd rather just go straight forward into introducing Ron, that would be fine too. How would you like to proceed?
As a courtesy, I want to let Ron and Riane go ahead, and then at the end, we'll see how it is, and then I can go jump into some of those remarks.
Perfect. Do you have a little intro of Ron you'd like to offer?
I do. And so thank you so much, Julie, for that sharing. And Ron Clark is the minister of the Agape Church of Christ in downtown Portland, Oregon. He's been in ministry for over 30 years, and he's an adjunct instructor for Portland Seminary and is co-chair of the Pacific Northwest Society of Biblical Literature's World of Early Christianity and the New Testament Scriptures section. He's authored books and articles concerning intimate partner violence and theology, Bible studies and ministry, and marriage and family ministry. Ron has a Master's of Divinity and a Doctorate of Ministry from Harding School of Theology in Memphis, Tennessee. He and his wife, Lori, planted Agape Church of Christ in downtown Portland in 2007 and lead ministries with various state, county, and local government agencies addressing houselessness, prostitution, abuse, trafficking, and developing healthy marriages. Ron and Lori have been married since 1987 and have 3 sons. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you. I put 1987 because I knew that year. I just always get it wrong. 30, 31, 32. So, but thank you. I feel very honored to be part of this discussion and reading Riane's book and then meeting her, wonderful, generous woman, and meeting Sarah and Ann as well. And then I've known Julie for quite a while and just impressed with her work. I remember seeing Julie on Broken Vows, the first video we saw about this. And, you know, when I met her, I told Lori, I said, we met a movie star. And she said, no, don't say that to her. So, so I wanted to kind of share in the 10 minutes kind of my journey. Basically, I grew up, I was the oldest of 2 boys, and my dad was a fighter pilot, and he was controlling. He wasn't physically abusive, but I grew up, you know, with a dad that used to tell me things like, you're just a damn jock. You'd pass up screwing a girl to lose weight. I know that's a harsh statement. That's what my dad would say to me. He said a lot of things like that. Like, when I was a senior, you need to date a freshman. She'll let you do what you want to her. And here I was, you know, I was in sports. I was a good student. But I kept going. My mom drugged me to church. My dad was an atheist, and my mom literally drugged my brother and I. But I got in, I started going to Fellowship of Christian Athletes with some of my friends on the sports team. And I'm thankful that those guys were in my life, because I would look back now and say, yeah, there was probably misogyny in that. But they at least helped me to get a good head about how do you treat people? How do you treat women? So flash forward into ministry. I got converted in University of Missouri at 21. And after being in ministry a while, Lori and I were in a very small rural area in Missouri, and we were working with a small church, and at a ministerial alliance, all the ministers come together once a month. We have discussions. A woman who was the director of the new abuse shelter showed up and told us about the shelter, that it was new and what was going on. So we were pretty excited about it. So Lori and I started helping with the abuse shelter, and we'd say, what can we do? And they'd have us, working on fences, mowing, cleaning. Then we started doing pizza parties, and, it just kept developing into a relationship where they began to send women and the children to our church. They invited us to trainings. I remember one time our 3 elders, older guys who were World War II vets, and I went to our first abuse training. We were completely blown away and maybe traumatized, I guess is what the shelter told us. But, these guys were like, that ain't right. You don't treat women that way. And, I remember in those early stages, Lori getting the people at church to have a training. We learned from the shelter that they needed faith community and that faith was important. And, we did a lot of Bible studies with the women, surveys, and we found that this was a shelter that said, we need the churches here. When we left and moved to Portland, we were telling her goodbye and hugging her, and the director said, do you remember that day when we met at the ministers' meeting? I said, yeah, a pivotal point in my life, and very transformative. She said, you're the only church that showed up to go. And I want you to know that when you go to Portland. That's how it is. So coming to Portland, it was the same thing. We started working in the community. Agencies invited us on. We did, Attorney General, Sexual Assault Task Force, trafficking agencies, getting appointed to task force. And all along, agencies have said, we need you at the table. We want you at the table. We need the faith community here. There were conferences I spoke at that were paid by agencies. They wanted us out there. What started happening then is we started doing clergy trainings in Portland, and I started writing all of this. Advocates were saying, you need to write this up, publish it, and all this. So we started doing that. We started running into issues that faith communities weren't as excited about coming to the table. And so we had advocates who said, we need you at the table. Faith communities weren't interested in coming to the table. So on the next slide that you'll see, it's an interesting study done by the Sojourners and Lifeway. Next study. Sorry. It's a study that was done with pastors on the next, there we go. And you can see that, almost 50% of pastors rarely or never speak about domestic violence. And the Lifeway research, the Sojourners research in 2013 revealed just attitudes that pastors have. That most pastors believe that domestic violence is not a problem. It's not common in their church. They still do couples counseling. You heard what Julie was telling you back in the 50s is still going on today. I teach seminary, and I've got students telling me that this is still going on. Mm-hmm. We work with women. It's still going on. And so clergy have developed this, this reputation of being necessary in the movement, but we're not very effective. Mm-hmm. And that's been the concern that we've been having. And we've been, I would say we've been butting heads with this. And so what has happened is we've started, as a text person, I've been going back to the text, the Hebrew, the Greek, the theology stuff, and saying, what is it that we bring to the table? And, I would suggest, and what I've been writing about and sharing mostly and working with individuals is the biblical text tells us that God listens to the voice of the oppressed. The gospel, the Torah, the exile, the biblical message, the preaching, proclamation always comes from the margins. Mm-hmm. It doesn't come from the place of power. And of course, in Portland, this has expanded into our homeless ministry, the Black Lives Matter movement, our work with police and talking about racism, underlying racism. That Portland's a very racist city. Sojourners reminded us of that. We have all of these people to talk about how progressive and weird we are. We're a racist city. And what we're seeing is that the proclamation of the faith community must come from the margins. What we've been dealing with as church planters, and we were at a big church for 8 years, wonderful group of people. We left and planted a church in inner city. And we've just seen this complete shift of how Christianity is viewing themselves with church growth material. It's about big, it's about better, it's about rich, it's about power. It's not about the concept of God hearing the voice of the oppressed. We see this in the Exodus. God hears the voice of the slaves. God confronts Pharaoh, the person in power. In the exile, the people of God are under, the Babylonian Empire. God goes to the captives. Jesus is homeless. Jesus is marginalized. He comes from a lower class family. His mom was a widow. I mean, he comes from the margins. And what we're seeing is that faith communities aren't realizing that message. And when it comes to domestic violence, you have passages such as Proverbs 21, the person who turns their ear to the cry of the oppressed will cry out and not be heard. Matthew 5, where Jesus says, if you've got something or your brother or sister has something against you, lay it down at the altar, go make it right with them. 1 Peter 3:7, husbands who are harsh with their wives, God doesn't hear their prayers. I mean, there's this whole underlying message that God hears the voice of the oppressed. What we're seeing is that the faith communities aren't doing that, or aren't doing a very good job of that. And this is why we don't talk about things in faith communities like toxic masculinity, which we're working on. Or even what we say, repentance. They talk more about forgiveness and repentance. Repentance, I have recovering people in recovery say repentance is making amends. If you don't understand what that means, watch My Name is Earl. I mean, that's all about making amends, but that is repentance. Abusive individuals need to repent. That's more than saying I'm sorry. So on the next slide, what we've been doing as we work with agencies, and I get asked by like area batter groups, say, come on in and tell us about, what text do we do when we work with Christian or faith communities or, Jewish people and Jewish individuals, Islamic. And we say, what we've been saying is actually, let's just decide that it's the text. The text is actually trying to promote peace. It's controlling people who are using the text. We all have the text, and we can't blame the text for making us controlling. We're controlling because we live in a culture that oppresses women, that doesn't listen to the voice of those who are vulnerable. And so we've suggested at least to the intervention providers, controlling and violent people use sacred text to control, manipulate, and exploit others. Peaceful people use sacred text to treat people with respect and enhance themselves and others. And then, of course, we go on that the sacred texts teach peace, love, harmony, mercy. But in America, at least, and I'll be going to Malawi in July to work with congregations in the UN there, and same thing over there. In those cultures, America, those cultures, other cultures, for men to be compassionate, merciful, loving, and caring is a sign of weakness. Sacred texts don't bring that out. Now, I understand that the sacred texts, are problematic, and part of working with the text is we try to go and look at the text, work through it. But I always suggest that the texts are meant to promote peace, and so you can't justify oppressing others by using the text. Faith communities have this resource, and even though people want to talk about Ephesians 5, it begins with verse 21, submit to each other. And Lori and I wrote a book on marriage, and we say marriage is about mutual respect, mutual submission, mutual support, mutual encouragement. But most people don't begin there. They begin with verse 22, attacking the wife, and they don't talk about the fact that the husband has 3 times as many verses, and they're much more challenging, and they're calling him to be nurturing.
Yeah.
So to kind of summarize in my short time here, just the idea, this has been my journey, and one thing that I've seen is that the agencies we work with say to the faith communities, we need you as part. You bring something to the table, and I think what we bring to the table is very powerful. But we as faith communities need to see the text as promoting peace. We need to be a people of promoting peace and confronting violence and holding batterers accountable.
All right.
Thank you so much for that, Ron. And I appreciated mostly the proclamation always comes from the margins, and just to kind of give us an image of the heart of Christ. And so back to Julie's power and control wheels, I wanted to just note that the power and control wheels are actually amazing instruments and of painting a picture of how violence, how people use the power that they have to control others. And the physical dynamics of the power and control wheel aren't often talked about. But what's in the center of any power and control wheel is what the people are after or what they get. And then the spokes in all of the pictures are how they do it. And then on the outside is kind of what holds it together. And so when we are talking about this idea of a new perspective on domestic violence and social justice and faith, it's important that in the faith community, as is instilled for many believers that have been a part of the church for their lives, is that those scriptural components actually hold together all of those beliefs, and then the experiences of seeing people with the power in the hierarchies be able to use those scriptures. They get grafted into us from the time that we're yay high, and it takes really an unpacking of all of that for us to change, repent, and go in a different direction. And so it's important for us to be paying attention to those things as we try to bring this whole conversation of having a new perspective and, in essence, permission to behave differently than we've always behaved and then we've always been exposed to. And so thank you very much. And I'll kind of weave some of my initial comments in here as we kind of move through the next, but we do want to make sure that we have time for Riane and then time for our audience to ask questions. There are a number of fantastic questions being chatted in on the side of our panel, and we want to make sure that we get to some of those things. And so I will just kind of shift gears and move forward in reading some information on Riane Eisler, JD, who is internationally known as a systems scientist, attorney working for the human rights of women and children, and author of groundbreaking books such as The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, now in 26 foreign editions, and The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics. Dr. Eisler has received many honors, including honorary PhDs and Peace and Human Rights Award. She lectures worldwide with venues including the United Nations General Assembly, the U.S. Department of State, congregational briefings, universities, corporations, conference keynotes, and events hosted by heads of state. Riane is a president of the Center for Partnership Studies, dedicated to research and education on social and economic transformation. She's also a co-founder of CPS's Caring Economy campaign and the Nobel Peace Laureate Betty Williams of the Spirit Alliance to Stop Human Intimate Violence, SAVE, and editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, an online peer-reviewed journal housed at the University of Minnesota, which was actually inspired by Eisler's work. Riane, welcome.
Thank you. And I'm so glad, Renita, that finally we were able to get you.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. I want to first thank all of you, Julie, Ron, Renita, Sarah, and behind the scenes, and all of you who are here in the chat box, and even those who haven't chatted, all of you who have come here. This is very exciting because what this is about really, and I will start also with my own story, emulating both Julie and Ron on this, but what this is really about is really to look at the roots of the violence that we are all finally acknowledging. I mean, I still remember when the police, if a woman was battered, they'd take the guy, walk him around the block, and send him home. And that was right here in the United States. And of course, I don't have to tell you, but maybe I do, that in many nations still today, there are no laws against domestic violence, and that, for example, in some world regions, so-called honor murders are still condoned and not prosecuted. So this notion of top-down control of, that wonderful graphic that you showed, Julie, is still very much embedded in our culture. And what we have to remember, I think, is that families do not arise in isolation.
Right.
They are part of the larger culture. So if we are to be successful, we really have to pay lots of attention to changing the larger culture, because otherwise, as both Ron and Julie have emphasized, we are on the margins, as unfortunately is still the case in so many faith communities. Now, I said I would talk a little about myself, and really this leads directly to it, because, oh dear, I forgot to turn off the telephones. Because I'm turning off my other phone too, because my work and the passion that I have for this work, which is really the work of cultural as well as personal and family transformation, is very deeply rooted way back in my childhood as a child refugee from the Holocaust with my parents. And can I have the first slide, please, Sarah? And that experience of having to flee with my parents after seeing my father dragged away by the Gestapo on Kristallnacht, which was so called because of all the glass that was broken in Jewish homes, in synagogues, in businesses, seeing him dragged away by the Gestapo, and by a miracle, my mother managed, with what I today call spiritual courage, the courage to stand up against injustice. She could have been killed. Many people were killed that night. She got him back, and we left in the middle of the night just carrying what we could with us. We managed, because fortunately the family had some means to purchase not only exit visas from the Nazis, but also to purchase an admission to Cuba, where I grew up, because the Nazis confiscated, that's the official word for armed robbery, everything my parents had. I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana. All of these experiences led me precisely to the question that's on this slide. Why, when we humans have such a capacity for consciousness, caring, and creativity, as evidenced by all of the wonderful people here at this webinar, why has our world seen so much cruelty, insensitivity, and destructiveness? And these are really the questions that animated my research many, many years later. And I should also say that there was another pivotal experience in my life, which happened in the late 60s, when, along with thousands of other women in the West, I suddenly woke up as if from a long drugged sleep to realize that, as much as having been born Jewish had almost cost me my life, having been born female had also enormously affected everything, my life options, not just that, the way I saw myself. And that was huge. So it was at that point that I started my activism, at the time called the Women's Liberation Movement. And I've always been so irritated by having it called Women's Lib. We wouldn't call Black liberation Black Lib. It's a symptom of something that I really want to get to, which is that we have all inherited a culture in which anything associated with women and with the feminine, caring, caregiving, nonviolence, is considered subordinate, inferior, is devalued. And this is really the basic problem. Can I have the next slide, please? To make a long story short, and this is a story told in all of my books and many articles, and of course, many speeches, what came out of my multidisciplinary cross-cultural research trying to answer the questions of my childhood was a completely new frame for looking at society, and families, because as I said, families, we have to really start looking at families, including family violence, in this larger frame of what kind of culture or subculture are we dealing with. And rather than the old categories of right versus left, religious versus secular, Eastern versus Western, you know them all. And you also notice something very interesting about those categories. None of them pay particular, if any, attention to the cultural construction of gender relations and parent-child relations. In other words, family relations. So this is not by accident. This serves a function, doesn't it? It maintains the devaluation of the female half of humanity, of course, and anything associated with it. So can I have the rest of the slide? Thank you, Sarah. You're right there with me. So what I started to see was that transcending these categories, because we've had oppressive and violent societies in every one of our conventional categories, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, are two underlying social configurations. On one side is what for lack of a name, I called one the domination system and the other one the partnership system. And these are very useful lenses for analyzing and also really intervening more effectively, because that's what this is about. It's not only about helping survivors, but preventing, changing the culture so that it'll never be completely violence-free. Sometimes we humans lose it, but look at what we really have here. In a domination system, there are rigid rankings and hierarchies of domination in both the family and the state, as Julie's diagram so beautifully showed. Whereas in a partnership-oriented society, and it's always a matter of degree, these principles are linking mutual respect and what I've called hierarchies of actualization rather than hierarchies of domination in both family and state. And why? We need new words, new language if we're going to change thinking. We know from linguistic psychology that the categories, the social categories we have available, channel our thinking, don't they? I mean, take matriarchy and patriarchy. They're two sides of a domination coin. Partnership is the real alternative, and we haven't had that. So, and we need a word like hierarchy of actualization because, yes, we need parents, we need teachers, we need leaders, we need managers, but power doesn't have to be this power over, the power to control that both Ron and Julie noted is really at the heart, isn't it? At the root of the violence. It's, I am entitled to control you. And so this requires, of course, rigid gender stereotypes that rank men over women as well as masculinity over femininity. And yes, it requires violence. And I really want you to think about that for a moment, because ultimately, what maintains domination systems, whether it's in the family, whether it's in the nation, whether it's in the family of nation, is really fear and the threat of force. That's how the domination system is constructed. And you have this built-in violence, so that child and wife beating and warfare are built into the system. By contrast, while they're obviously, as I said, you're going to have some violence erupt once in a while, in a partnership structure, in a system where the values are different, where you have gender partnership and where you have the valuing of caring, caregiving, and nonviolence in women, men, and social and economic policy, which is what so many of our scriptures are actually about, aren't they? Except those are not the ones that people who want to be on top, right? Whether it's as heads of family or heads of states. I mean, they don't focus on those, but we have to refocus attention. And yes, in partnership systems, nurturing and sustaining life is highly valued, and violence is not needed to maintain the hierarchies of domination. So this is why, can I have the next slide? Culture change is so important. And one of the instruments now that have been used, and I'm trying to condense a tremendous amount of information into a very short presentation here, is we have to really pay close attention to gender-based socialization, which we have inherited from more rigid domination times. And when I talk of more rigid domination times, I want you to really think not just of, ISIS, for example, which is a really example of or some of the would-be ISIS, of religious fundamentalism, which is, theocratic control, top-down control in the state or tribe, rigid subordination of women in families that are highly punitive, right? Violence is built into the system. And of course, these very gender stereotypes in which boys are taught that their identity is defined by not being feminine, right? By not being caring, by not being nonviolent. I mean, this toxic masculinity that we're just beginning to unpack. I mean, it's been studied now. This is recent stuff, and I want to say that the sign of hope is that in the last decades, men's studies, women's studies, gender studies have come on the scene, but they're still ghettoized, whereas they actually need to be part of the general conversation, which is beginning to happen, thank goodness, with, for example, this understanding of, quote, male entitlement. That's part of the domination system, isn't it? And the Me Too movement. But what I'm trying to say is that, and I'm being very nonlinear here, is that we're beginning to leave some of this rigid gender socialization behind in some aspects of our culture, but not in all. And I am suggesting to you that we really have to make this a top priority. Can I have the next slide? Because how we socialize children is not just a gender issue. It is a core human and social issue. That's how we learn what it means to be human, where both boys learn what it means to be a human male, and where girls learn what it's supposed to be a human female. And for girls to continue to be indoctrinated into subservience, I mean, think about it, whether it's the racism in the United States, or whether it's Shia versus Sunni in the Middle East, it's this in-group versus out-group thinking that's modeled by this male superior, female inferior model of humanity. And it is not coincidental, and I cannot repeat this enough, that cultures and subcultures that are racist, that are, enemy-oriented, conquest-oriented, really also view and have internalized this male superior, female inferior, quote, masculine as misdefined, really, in domination systems. As that's just how it is. Well, it isn't how it is. There are many cultures going way back. I mean, I won't go into this, but I mean, in the Chalice and the Blade, I describe a whole millennia of our prehistory that oriented more to partnership. There are we're moving in a partnership direction today. There are nations, Sweden, Finland, Norway, where we see much more gender equality, and not coincidentally, what we see there is the unpacking, as Ron and Julie said, of this old model. And peace studies and laws against violence against women and children are not coincidental in these more partnership-oriented societies. It's part of a configuration. Next slide, please. So what I'm really saying is that the contemporary questioning of stereotypical gender roles and relations is nothing less than questioning what it means to be human. And this is root stuff, because only as we disentangle masculinity from violence, domination, and entitlement, and so-called femininity from subordination, that wonderful wheel that you saw and that wonderful diagram that you saw, only as we unpack and disentangle this can we truly build safer, more caring families and societies. So what I'm not saying that we should stop doing all the wonderful work on the ground that so many of you are doing. It is essential. And it is essential, yes, to bring this information into faith communities and these tools. At the same time, what I'm suggesting to you is that we have to really all participate in working for fundamental cultural transformation from domination to partnership. Because if we don't do this, can I have the next slide, please? We fail to pay attention to something that really takes us to the wider picture now, to that historically fiscal priorities have followed gendered values, where women are devalued, so-called masculine, because by now it has nothing to do with anything inherent in women or men. Caring men like Ron, like my wonderful partner and husband, they just have a hard time in domination systems, don't they? Because they're despised as wimps, as sissies, right? Whereas they are actually men who have reclaimed part of their true humanity, for goodness sakes. So, but in domination system, domination, violence become fiscal priorities. So what do you have? You have higher investments in weapons, wars, prisons. Whereas as we move more and more towards partnership, where women are highly valued, yes, so-called feminine priorities, caring, caregiving, food for all children, health care for all children. You know what I'm talking about. And recognition of the importance of the work of care, which is one of the major reasons that women, and we see that not only in the market, but in the United States, where professions such as caregiving are so poorly paid, and so many immigrant women, African American women are poor because that work is not recognized. But we see it worldwide because, yes, worldwide women are the mass of the world's poor. And one of the major reasons is this devaluation of care work, and not to speak of the devaluation of nonviolence. But anyway, in more partnership-oriented societies, you do have higher investment in care of humans and nature, because the two go together. And of course, you have less violence. So do I have another slide, or is this my last slide? Oh, well, this is my last slide. So I just want to close by saying again that I'm not saying that we shouldn't work on intervention. We have to, and we have to bring the faith communities into this. At the same time, I want to invite all of you to really think of prevention. Mm-hmm. And prevention is working on the roots of violence through understanding, first of all, the domination elements we've inherited, and we're trying to move away from, and by understanding the core elements of the partnership culture, and that, yes, gender and childhood must be considered in rebuilding society in a more equitable, caring, and nonviolent way. I thank you.
Thank you, Riane. And excellent, very great. I think what's interesting is you all shared three very different perspectives in terms of your story, and what was evident is that each one of you received messages in your experiences that had some expectations to them, and oftentimes the messaging said that violence was, you could use violence to get power, or you are powerful if you use violence. And that, of course, affects the attitudes. And I think that the education piece, as you move towards a partnership model, is primary. And so just giving people, again, permission to think very differently about how they've ever thought about what it is to have power and to use it in a way that's honorable to the human spirit is just a great conversation to be in. One of the things that I had in my opening remarks was that the reality is we all use violence. And I think that unless our hearts are changed, then how much violence we use is really the only difference amongst every human being in this world. And when we're given permission to use something like Riane, you were saying, other than violence for community building and for relationship negotiations, I think that something marvelous kind of erupts. And so we have there is a lot of collective experience on the panel. And so what I want to do is just probably ask one or two questions of the panel and then move to a short period of questions from our audience. And so one of, I guess, the questions that might shed some light on this whole idea of social justice and human rights is why violence, specifically certain types of violence against certain types of either people groups or marginalized populations, why hasn't it been considered a social justice or human rights issue?
Well, I will jump in, and I see how late it is getting to be because we started late. So I would like to make a suggestion. I can address that question. I think we all did. I mean, when you have a system that depends on violence to maintain certain rankings of domination, you're going to hide that because at least, well, you don't hide it in some societies. Let's be clear. I mean, in some societies, a man's, quote, honor is associated with his amount of control over subordinates, starting with women and children, but also, quote, inferior men. And you see that in tribal societies. To this, I mean, the Middle East, for example, in ISIS is a good example of that. But obviously, the answer to that question is that these groups have been so devalued that this type of social organization and using violence to maintain it was considered necessary, normal, even moral. And that's our challenge. But could we go, I mean, if I may say, two questions to discussing with the audience. I mean, giving every panelist a chance to chime in on this question, and then just go quickly to conversing with our wonderful participants, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely. And so there have been several fantastic questions.
I thought maybe Julie and Ron want to chime in on this.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
I think you did a great job on that. So I don't think we need to add to it really. I think you covered it, Riane.
Yeah, and I think I think it was very well said. I think we can also add humiliation. It's the use of violence to humiliate others, and having boys who play football, and I've had to talk with coaches about using feminine terms to put boys in line, and I say we've all been raised that way, but it's a way of humiliating someone else, and so we humiliate females in anything labeled feminine,
and I'll add, because I think, when I talk about domestic violence, I didn't really define it other than to show the power and control wheel. I think most women who have been abused, their experience is not necessarily physical abuse, that it's that coercive control, it's that taking away of freedoms. It's not just what a man who's abusive does to his partner, it's what he robs her of, her liberty, her freedoms, her self-determination. And I think this is underestimated in terms of how it impacts women in general. And it's not necessarily against the law. Those of you who live in England and France and some other places, psychological abuse is against the law. And although some might say coercive control and psychological abuse are two different things, I think both of them are extraordinarily damaging, whether you're talking about threats or you're talking about taking away someone's rights, human rights.
Mm-hmm. And I really want to second that, because I think that it's amazing to me. I mean, I've worked so long on bringing the human rights of women and children to the fore for decades. It's amazing to me that this has only started to happen because of this kind of work in the last several decades. I mean, we're talking about the majority of humanity, for goodness sakes. But anyway,
Exactly.
let's get to our wonderful participant attendees. And Sarah, have you been collecting questions or?
Well, what we thought we would do is, as promised, if you are here with us from one of our co-sponsoring organizations, I'd like to invite you now to chat your questions, and we'll take a couple of those first and then move to some of the wonderful many questions from our other attendees as well. There are, as you can imagine, far more wonderful questions than we will have time for today. But I want to suggest a couple things. One is that there are already sort of some talks about a potential second part to this webinar. There's so much more to talk about than we'll have. This is just really a very beginning point today. So keep that in mind. And also, thank you for your questions. They're always provocative for insight and awareness for everyone, whether or not we have time to answer them verbally today in the session. Mm-hmm. So let me scroll down to so let's take George Kilpatrick's question of whether we might speak a bit to the intersection of poverty and domestic violence. We know we've talked about other forms of intersectionality here and the way in which our domination structures of gender relations impact relations across all lines of difference. But how might we think about poverty in particular around these issues of violence?
Well, should I go first? Or?
Absolutely.
Please, Ron.
I just wrote a blog about Adam Rippon's comment about Tonya Harding, and I think if you've watched Tonya Harding's movie, she was a woman traumatized by a man, mm-hmm. and how the system treated her as a poor, in their words, white trash, using their words, how they treated her as a poor individual. I think it shows that we treat poverty, domestic violence, people of color, we have that same attitude that they're complaining, they're oversensitive, that they don't see reality as it really is, and I think we feminize groups of individuals, and I see that intersection of violence and poverty as we see them as not being credible. Mm-hmm. We can add children in that. Highest sexual assault survivors are females, 12 to 15. What do we say about little girls?
Right.
So I think all of that is a group of people that we feel we don't need to listen to. And so that's my thought.
Thank you. Can I take that to the systemic level again, which is I always like to look at both the trees and the forest.
Right.
And what I see is that domination systems artificially produce poverty through a variety of means, all the way from misdistribution of resources to invest, we invest more in weapons than in caring for people, for example. And, we need some weapons in a world that orients to still, in some places, much more to domination. But there are limits here. But we also have to understand that this intersectionality is not coincidental, that it's part of a system that artificially creates inequality.
Right.
Not that sameness, you see, we're talking about equal valuing and equal opportunity, not about sameness. So I think that we have to take into account the fact that has been well documented that worldwide women and children are the mass of the world's poor and the poorest of the poor. Let's unpack some of this and really look at it. And as I said, part of the reason that immigrant women and African-American women are really, the wage gap is huge, is because of the devaluation of this work of care. It's the misogyny that intersects with the racism, that intersects with the economic equality. That's why I really urge you to think of it in terms of partnership and domination systems.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Julie?
Well, I feel like so much has already been said. I don't know that I can really add to it. I think, if we're going to stop gender-based violence, we have to stop raising batterers. We have to stop raising boys who see themselves as different than girls, and that means that religion, parenting, social structures, everything that underpins a society and culture has to shift. And it seems insurmountable at some times, but I do see some change happening. I have hope here in the United States, Me Too, Time's Up, and even there's Church Too movement now, which is great. But it's all about how we are going to raise the children. To me, that's the bottom line. We can do all the prevention and intervention in the world and around changing laws and so forth and so on. But if people grow up with the same attitudes that caused the problem, it's not going to change. The same belief systems. And beliefs are learned and they can be unlearned. That's the thing. That's what some of the great prevention programs are doing, I think.
Julie, I want to add something though. In Sweden, for example, and Norway and Finland, where there are laws, which is a trend against using any form of physical discipline, the attitudes have changed. So the laws are not they're needed as part of the culture change, is what I'm saying.
Yes, I agree, absolutely.
Justice Brown versus the Board of Education was essential in terms of ending segregation in the United States. These are all tools for change.
Just as the ERA is, which we still don't have. I know you wrote a book about it decades ago. We still don't have equal rights for women in the United States. CEDAW has not been ratified by the United States, So these agreements are important because they speak to a society's values.
And I love what John just posted, that every revolution seems impossible at the beginning, and after it happens, it was inevitable. And I'd like to change that from revolution to transformation.
Right.
Because we do have this notion that somehow change is achievable through violence. And look at what happened in the former Soviet Union and China. They just replaced another domination regime for an earlier one because the underlying culture with its misogynism wasn't changed.
Exactly.
We're coming down to the end.
I was just going to say that, Renita, would you like to guide it sort of, and actually there are a number of questions relating to sort of how we imagined we might close in terms of some more resources and ideas for steps steps. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Renita, to guide our final segment here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And so, yes, we have had a number of questions guiding. And fortunately, we have had someone keeping notes, and all of those things will be available, and you won't have missed much in terms of the questions that were posed. What we hoped for was some closing remarks in this last 10 minutes, and we will get to that in terms of each panelist being able to just answer just one thing that is a next thing that we can do to really impact change in the areas that we've talked about. I think that that if all of us behave differently, if we want it to be a nonviolent society, we have to, even in our spheres of influence, behave in ways that are not violent, from the formal physical violence to other kind of ways that we use our powers and our positional authorities to usurp the power of other folks. And so as in the last few moments, if you all each could kind of just give a closing remark of a resource that you think is particularly impactful, or a model that you would like to share that will be useful to our audience.
Well, I shared a bit in the chat box. I really think that the bystander model is something that has great promise and has been successful. Jackson Katz, the MVP model, I'm trying to remember what it stands for. Well, it's mentors in violence prevention. And the idea is that we teach men and women to see and to speak up and to model what we're talking about, to model partnership, to talk about it, to challenge abuse and violence and, jokes, the use of pornography, which is pretty much all violence against women these days. So to talk about it and to not to feel like you have to be an expert, but just to use what you do know, to take the knowledge that you have, and to not be silent, because silence is the voice of complicity. We have to take a stand. Otherwise, we're siding with the oppressor. Mm-hmm. We have to do something differently. And so I think there are some great models out there that are working well. I've mentioned a few in the chat box. And if we can, I don't know that we have the chat? Is that something that you could share with folks?
Yes. And I think Anne has been sharing that in the chat, that we can, we'll tidy up the chat a little bit, but make that part of our follow-up to share with people, because there are so many resources.
Yes. Thank you, participants. Great resources. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the last thing I would say is, one of the things I've learned from the Bible is to seek one of my favorite scriptures is actually in the Old Testament, the Torah, seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That's pretty good advice for all of us, in my opinion.
Julie, I have to interject. One of the things that I have so wished for is for theologians from all the major world religions to get together and to really sort the scriptures, showing what has been misinterpreted, as well as what has been added in the course of domination history.
Yes.
To justify and rationalize and make domination and violence seem normal, and so that people who read these scriptures have a guide. And if you and Ron want to give that some thought, and also Renita, I think it could make such a huge difference. It's a resource that doesn't yet exist. I've tried to talk about it in some of my books, especially in Sacred Pleasure, which is about sex, myth, and the politics of the body, and looks at both spirituality and sexuality through the lenses of the partnership domination.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Julie.
I was just going to say a big part of that in your book, and something that's been very meaningful to me is, as I've evolved over the years, is really embracing the fact that God is not gendered, and talking about God in a way that's non-gendered, which you address in that particular book. And I think that's really important. That it took me a long time to get to the place where I actually love the fact that I believe in Mother, Father God, not just a Father God, that God is not gendered. God, we all represent creation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, and I think that really the faith communities, I hope, will start talking about domestic violence, which is a term I really don't like because it's violence in family, for goodness sakes, as a social justice issue, not as a, quote, women's issue. Because immediately, if you label it, quote, a women's issue, all that old conditioning to make it less important kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
Human rights. It's human rights and social justice.
And social justice. I mean, reframing, using different language. I think this is so important. And if I may, since this is a question, and I want Ron to get a chance too, I'd like to point to two immediate resources that come to mind. And one, and they're both available on our website, which is centerforpartnership.org. One is the integrated progressive political agenda. And hopefully Anne will find it and put it up. But I think we have to understand that the people pushing us back have an integrated agenda. For them, these so-called women's and children's issues have been on the top in a horrible way, but they've been on the top. Mm-hmm. And yet for most progressives, they're still just women's and children's issues. Got to change that. The second resource is the Caring and Connected Parenting Guide. And I think that that's really, while it doesn't especially address what we must address, which is a stereotypical gender socialization, it does address caring and nonviolent socialization, which unfortunately, as you know, is still justified as God's will by some of the parenting guides floating around, and we've got to discredit those and stand up to them. Anyway, Ron, I want you to have a space. Julie and I have gotten very excited about all of this.
The question was resources?
Mm-hmm. Resources.
Two videos that I think are very powerful. Broken Vows, obviously is great because for us it helps. If you're not used to working in this area, it helps people hear stories of survivors. Tough Guys by Jackson Katz, addressing masculinity. And I wrote Am I Sleeping with the Enemy in 2010, and Jackson Katz endorsed it along with Patrick Lemon, who co-founded Men Can Stop Rape. And I talk more about this in the faith community, what we're dealing with. So those are three resources that might help. But Broken Vows and Tough Guys, I think you'll watch quite often. They're very, very good resources.
Thank you. And we will be remiss if we did not thank our sponsors. We have the Safe Alliance. We have Agape Church of Christ, Pathways to Safety International, North Carolina Council of Churches, the Pixel Project, Faith Trust Institute, and this am I. I'm not sure what
that is. That stands for the Battering Intervention Services Coalition of Michigan.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And to our panelists, thank you very much. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your heart for this work and for the heart for just a safer existence of humanity. And so, excellent.
Yeah.
And if I may, I will chime in and thank everyone on the panel, Sarah, Anne, and also I wish that we had more chance to talk with some of the attendees, but as Sarah said, maybe what we need to do is to have a follow-up session.
Yeah.
So thank you all and bless you all. And
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great information. Great
Thank you
sharing.
for this
Mhm.
chance.
Yes, thank you so much.
and
In terms of follow-up from this session, let me just say as we close that you can expect an email will come from Ann Anberg. It will include the slides that you saw today, a link to the replay of this recording that you can share with colleagues and friends, as well as resource list and the chat, which contains many more resources than the list that we sort of formally have put together for you. So watch for those in the next 24 hours or so. And we look forward to seeing you back again for perhaps part 2. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
thank you, and thank you especially Renita for coming in despite all of these technical difficulties.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you all. Thank you so much. This is great work.
Thank you. Nice to see
Thank you
all.
so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bless you.
I have plenty of pulled pork here. Nobody's eating it, so. All right.